Hi, I'm back, and the I can't get the desktop capture to work effectively on this, so um, just gonna have to provide um, the voiceover for the PowerPoint as I'm working through this now. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first slide, which I've called Views of Human Nature. And a nice illustration here you'll see of a Chinese temple, the gate, with a quotation by Confucius. And he says, by nature, men or human beings, inclusively, are similar. By practice, they are wide apart. And normally in class, I would ask someone what they think he means by such a quotation. By nature, men are similar. In other words, depending on cultural background, depending on ethnicity, depending on religious worldview, we all are born with a commonality, a commonality that philosophers would call human nature, that binds the human world together. But by practice, according to Confucius, it's our practice, our actions that differentiate us. And so you can see for Confucius, he's going to talk about potential and the need to cultivate that potential if you want to consider yourself a full human being. Okay, the second slide, you'll see an illustration of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a united China. Now, this was a few centuries after the time that we're going to be dealing with, the time of Lao Tzu and Confucius. And he's referred to simply as the first emperor because he comes at the end of a very chaotic time period in Chinese history called the Warring States period. And it's referred to by Chinese scholars as the Warring States period. It's about a 250-year period of history in China. You have the date there. The general date's about 475 to 221 BCE. And China is emerging from a feudal system, which was in the hands of landed nobility and kings, a series of princes and kings who would rule territories, vast territories. There wasn't really anything that we would call China in the time of Confucius. There were various states with rulers, and there was a main state, and they were referred to as the Eastern Zhou dynasty, or the Zhou rulers. It looks like Zhu, but it's pronounced Zhou, like G.I. Joe, Cho, or Zhou. And they lasted for quite a long period of time, and they ruled one of the regions in China, the region of Jin, and there's a lot of these different regions, and I can show you on the next map. But this emperor Qin Shi Huang, who's referred to as the first emperor of a united China, was a militarist, and he conquered or annexed all of the various states. And the Zhou dynasty came to an end, and the Qin dynasty, even though it's spelled with a Q, it sounds like Qin, and this is where we get the term, the modern English word for China, China, in a sense, the land of the Qin. And this guy is an interesting guy. You may have heard at least of the terracotta army that they've been excavating over the last, I would say, 20 years or so in People's Republic of China. And they found that this emperor had, in his worldview, he wanted his military, his army, in a sense, to accompany him when he died into the afterlife. And so he had artisans and craftsmen laboring on this model army. They were literally these soldiers that were made out of baked clay. That's why they're called the Terracotta Army. You can look this up on Wikipedia. With thousands of soldiers, very intricately designed, chariots, horses, birds, animals, etc. And this was only recently excavated. It's considered a wonder of the world, that he spent his whole dynasty, in a sense, his whole ruling period, upwards of 40 years, I think, having this afterlife army constructed, and this was to be buried with him. Very fascinating. But so he, in a sense, unifies China into what we consider China nowadays, into one imperial realm. But in that previous period, there were smaller fiefdoms and princedoms and kingdoms, in a sense, sort of an ancient sense, that were various states. And this was a very chaotic period. Some sociologists and archaeologists study this period, and they say, why was there so much warfare going on in especially China in this period? They find that the weaponry was becoming more destructive. We're leaving the heroic era behind, where the kings would meet each other on the battlefield, and we're entering more of a modern, although I hesitate to use the word modern, but more modern conceptions of warfare, conscripting all of the peasants in your region, all of the farmers, and giving them weapons and trying to annihilate your enemy and wipe out their population and subdue them and take their territory. Very destructive time period. And this is what's referred to as the Warring States. Confucius is born in the 500s, about midway through the 6th century BC, and he's born about 550 or 551 BCE. So he's older at the beginning of this Warring States period, and we'll cover him specifically when we get to Confucius and Confucianism. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of the historical backdrop to the development of what we call Taoism and Confucianism. Out of this very chaotic, warlike period, something arises called the 100 Schools of Thought. And it's not really an exaggeration. Many thinkers, many religious figures, sages, philosophers, for lack of a better term, are asking deeper questions at this point in their history and saying, how have we lost our way? Maybe we've displeased heaven. Maybe the emperor is no longer ruling with heaven's mandate, so to speak. And how have we lost our way of harmony? And out of this 100 schools of thought come Confucius, and hence Confucianism, and his solution to lack of Tao or lack of harmony is more of a social response, an ethical response. And he says what's taken place is a breakdown in the extended family, breakdown socially speaking. There's too much warfare going on, too much amassing personal fortune at the expense of the community and at the expense of the society. And so Confucius, in a sense, is looking back to a more ideal past, or at least his idealized view of the past, and saying, hey, there was this social morality and we need to return to that. We need to cultivate ourselves, and hence Confucianism comes to be a main response to this very chaotic, amoral time period referred to as the Warring States. And therefore the Confucian scholars were really big on education, state education, um, and focusing on morality and social interaction and fulfilling one's obligation. Now, the Taoism as an organized religion doesn't really get kickstarted until after this time period under the Han Dynasty, and they rule from after Qin, they rule from about 200 BCE to about 200 CE or AD. And that's really when Taoism kind of takes off as an organized religion and a philosophy. But Taoism looks back to its sage, Lao Tzu, or Master Lao, and the primary sacred text which is ascribed to him, it's called the Tao Te Ching, the book about Tao and De, and we'll talk about that. And he's really focused on the inner path, maybe more like Siddhartha, the Buddha. Although remember that Buddhism doesn't originate in China, it comes from India. It's imported to China about the 1st century CE. So it's not a player yet at this point in Chinese history. We're still talking about indigenous Chinese religions and responses to this very chaotic period about 2,400, 2,500 years ago. So Taoism takes its name from the Tao, which Tao simply means path or way, W-A-Y. And it's the idea that you can correlate yourself and your life in a harmonic way with the force of nature, the great Tao, the eternal Tao that expresses itself through life, through the universe, through nature, through humankind, through the animal world, through the natural world, etc. And that harmony, in a sense, already exists. It's not something that needs to be created by religion and philosophy. And therefore, our task as human beings, according to Lao Tzu and the Taoists, is simply to manifest the Tao within ourselves and really find our niche in the overall flow of life. Kind of like a river, and just flow, just go with the flow. I know it sounds kind of like a surfer philosophical theme. And it's interesting that the yin yang symbol, it's not a Buddhist symbol. A lot of people see that yin yang symbol and confuse it with Buddhism, but it's really a Chinese symbol, and there are variations of it. But the yin yang, it looks like two fish chasing each other, in a sense, or two tadpoles chasing each other's tails. And it's the idea that the Tao, the eternal Tao or way, manifests itself through a polarity or a dance, a harmony of opposites. Not so much good versus evil. That's more of a Western idea imposed upon that, but more of a harmony or a polarity of opposites, masculine, feminine, sun, moon, heat, cold, light, dark, etc. And in a sense, life is a cyclical manifestation of the eternal Tao, and therefore we need to align ourselves with this overall way or path of harmony through yin-yang correlation, mystical practices, meditation. Again, here it sounds a little bit like Buddhism, although the point in Taoism is not so much to escape from reality, and the Buddhist worldview is a little bit different from the Taoist worldview, so I don't want to confuse you too much on that. The legalists I have mentioned here, and they were important in the sense that under the Qin rulers, especially this first ruler, this first emperor, they were kind of the law and order guys, the Clint Eastwoods, go ahead, make my day. And they had a very negative view of human nature. And so you can see that really against the Confucian ideal of benevolence, right? Humanity and cultivating yourself. and an emphasis on Confucian morality, they're going to emphasize strictness, public executions, death penalty, over benevolence. And they're going to, in a sort of a Machiavellian sense, if you understand a little bit about Machiavelli, the means justify, or the ends justify the means, etc. And they have the ear of the emperors for a little bit, for a little while, and we're not really going to focus on them too much, but they had a very negative view of human nature, and their advice to the rulers was simply get the biggest stick you have and start whacking the people into submission. Now, the Taoists obviously are going to take exception with that, because they're going to emphasize that we need to trust our instincts, be childlike, and let the Tao flow, essentially, and practice something that the Taoists would call Wu Wei. We'll get to that again, or actionless action. Not being artificial, not trying to force the issue, but like the river, simply flowing around the obstacles that come into our path, and cultivate the Tao, and therefore find sort of an inner harmony, and therefore manifest this harmony and produce social harmony. And obviously, Confucius would have an issue or take issue with the legalists, because he's going to say the emperor that rules through fear of punishment is really not a good ruler in that sense. He has to cultivate morality. He has to be a father figure to his subjects, and then they will lovingly and longingly follow after him if they revere him as a father figure who loves them and takes care of them and provides for them, etc. And provides not only for their social needs and their physical needs, but also a good example as a ruler, and one that they would look up to and would want to follow. So you can see that the legalist view has a very negative view of human nature, as opposed to the positive view of human nature of the Taoists, and more of a neutral to positive side of the Confucianists. Let's take a look here at the next slide. If I can get this to come up. Excuse me. What you're looking at here is a contemporary photo of the tomb of Confucius, and he is revered as a model teacher, and he was from a town called Chufu. So this is in Chufu in Shandong province now, which is a contemporary province of the People's Republic of China. But if you look to the map on the right, this is roughly 500 BCE. So this is the world in which Confucius is living. And he's in the state of Lu right here on the Yellow Sea. Chufu in the state of Lu. Now, the Taoist sage Lao Tzu is more centrally located here in Luoyang, Luoyi at the time it was called, Luoyang, which is a city on a river here, and it was the capital of the Jin rulers and the Eastern Zhou rulers. And so, by tradition, he works in a library there in the archive. And we'll talk a little bit about him when we get there. But this is just to show you what the tomb of Confucius looks like now. And this is a little incense holder in front of his tomb. And pilgrims would visit, and they would burn incense, and they would offer prayers on behalf of, to Confucius as a sage, etc., and in honor and in respect of him there. If you move to the next slide, this is from a mural in a temple complex. And this is rather mythical here. And this is just showing how in the oral tradition, there was a proverbial meeting between a very young Confucius as a student here, as a young scholar with an important post. And you can see he's represented by his scrolls or his books, the books that he worked on. Don't think in terms of modern books, because paper hadn't been invented yet at the time that we're talking about. And so important documents, they would carve strips of bamboo and ancient Chinese was read from top down. It wasn't right to left or left to right. It was top down, and so on each of the strips of bamboo, there would be, with the horsehair and with ink, there would be, in Chinese calligraphy, they would paint pictographs representing words and concepts. For example, the Tao. There's a pictograph that represents Tao, not only the word path or way, but also the concept, philosophically and religiously speaking. And so here's a young Confucius, showing his book learning, etc. here, and he is ushered into the presence of the great Taoist sage, Lao Tzu, or Master Lao, and you can see that they're having a dialogue or a conversation. We don't have any historical corroboration that such a meeting took place, but it is interesting in the traditions that this meeting is emphasized. And it's also interesting that they essentially agreed to disagree, that Lao Tzu recognized that Confucius was a very moral man, had a lot of book knowledge even at a young age, but that ultimately his path was a different path, and that at this point Lao Tzu had already begun to withdraw from public life. And you can see even here, this is most likely a mural taken from a Taoist temple, because Lao Tzu is depicted by this artist almost already in heaven. You can see surrounded by clouds. He's got a young servant here with a fan. He's holding his hand up in a gesture sort of both of a blessing, but also holding Confucius and his learning at a distance there. And we'll explain how in Taoism they're a little bit skeptical about book learning, and they say that knowledge does not necessarily guarantee wisdom. And then you'll notice that there's an aura or a halo, that Lao Tzu is depicted already as deified here, as one of the immortals of the Tao, that he's channeling this Tao. One other detail that you'll maybe notice off to the right here is something called a Chinese zither, or just a real rudimentary version of a harp, essentially a plank of wood with some strings. And Confucius was a musician himself. We know this because he edited a book called the Book of Odes, or the Book of Songs, and that he himself played the zither, or the Chinese harp. And he believed that it could be a way that would help educate children and show them how, through lessons and discipline, that they could create something of beauty. And so it's interesting that this artist has included the zither, not only that Confucius was a scholar, but also that he was a musician. So I think that's an interesting detail. Okay, if we go to the next slide, then you'll see a silk painting, a traditional representation of Lao Tzu. Now he's very, very old, depicted as bald, with his beard, and he's sort of wrinkled here. And he's holding a scroll in his right hand, and in his left hand he's holding the reins of his trusted ox, or his water buffalo. And he's heading off from society into isolation to end his life. And there are various versions of kind of the oral tradition about how he ended his life, but in some versions it's interesting. He ascends to heaven, almost like a Christ-like figure, because he's mastered the Tao so much in his personal life that he's become one with it, and in a sense he's found the secret of immortality, and he ascends to heaven and becomes what are referred to in religious Taoism as the immortals of the Tao, those who cultivated the Tao to an extreme to where they were no longer bound by physical life. So I think that's an interesting detail as well. The scroll that he would be holding in his hand here would be the document that's referred to on the right hand. And this is just a close-up of a Chinese manuscript version of this, but originally it was composed also on bamboo strips. And here's a quotation from the Tao Te Ching, the short little treatise that's attributed to Master Lao. 81 stanzas. Very, very difficult book to sort of get the understanding and the correct interpretation. And he himself would probably say every interpretation, in a sense, is based on the personal meaning of the interpreters. But look what he says here. He says, this book is no different from other books in that it is a dead thing. But you can bring it to life if you put into practice what is written in it. And so again, in the Tao Te Ching, he'll begin with the statement that the Tao that can be talked about or can be discussed is not the eternal Tao. So in a sense, he's already saying that by trying to capture it in words, we're losing the essence of the Tao, of the force of life, the way of life, or the path of life. Here are some themes, some Taoist themes, and again we have our little a close-up of our depiction here of Master Lao, Lao Tzu, and you're really not supposed to know 100% whether he's leading the ox or whether the ox is simply carrying him. And so there's a symbiotic relation, a symbiosis that exists between the world of nature represented by the ox and the human world represented by Lao Tzu here. Here are some themes that we take from the Tao Te Ching. The first one is stillness. He talks about in the document, he talks about being still. We have no control over provocation. If we're likened to a pond, people are going to throw rocks at us, and that's going to stir up the muck and the murk. But if we're able to be still, ultimately that stuff will again sink to the bottom, and the water will become clear again and visible. So he talks about stillness and the ability to be comfortable with yourself and not always be distracted, not always seeking something to sort of fill the space, so to speak, being comfortable in your own skin. Flexibility is a very important Taoist trait, being flexible, being open to new things. And again, this is simply reflecting the Tao. The Tao is flexible, the Tao is still, the Tao is spontaneous. The Tao is the mother. He refers to the great Tao as the womb, literally the mother of the 10,000 things. She gives birth to things and names them and gives them identity. They arise from her and they return to her at their physical demise. But she continues, the Tao continues to generate things in that sense, the things of the visible universe. And so we have to be still, we have to be flexible, we have to be spontaneous. Maybe when we travel or in our day-to-day lives, we can be more open to the things that cross our path. And not only can we be open to new experiences and new people and new perspectives, but this can help us. We can look at these things as serendipitous in a sense, as being surprised by life, and not simply looking out the window and saying, "Oh, it looks like it's going to be a rainy day. What a bummer! I can't go outside," etc. Lao Tzu would say we need to be spontaneous. We need to be childlike in a sense, and just embrace the world for what it's worth. Therefore, we need to trust our instinct, trust your nature. Intuitive people would already understand how this trait works, right? Your gut feeling. If you've been in a situation where you just didn't feel right with the people or with the place, and you followed your nature, you didn't talk yourself out of that, or you didn't cave into peer pressure, that would be something that Lao Tzu would say, pay attention to that, because the Tao is flowing through you, the Tao is speaking through you in a sense. Simplicity, living a simple life. Again, this is probably where Taoism comes into contact with Buddhism, emphasizing the Buddha's understanding of the middle way, taking just enough, but not taking too much. And so, therefore, being simple, even if you're in a position of power. Lao Tzu would say the emperor himself still has to act with simplicity and, in a sense, allow the right action to arise spontaneously without artificiality. And this is a big one here. Knowledge does not necessarily guarantee wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to use your experience and your knowledge. The Taoists become very skeptical of book learning. And so when they look at the educational process, especially in the hands of the Confucians, the Confucian scholars, they're going to say that, just because you know a lot of stuff, just because you're a smart person with a high IQ doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to be a good person or that you're going to use your knowledge wisely. And so the focus then will be on wisdom and cultivating the Tao and mastering the Tao and allowing the Tao to master you in a sense, as opposed to simply filling your head with facts and ideas, etc. I wonder what Lao Tzu would think of Google. Anyway, that's a speculation. The last one here, Wu Wei. Wu Wei Wu. It's Chinese. It's really a contradiction. It means actionless action or acting without action. It doesn't mean not doing anything, which is a lot of the time how it's translated into English. It means strength through yielding, acting without effort, acting without artificiality, acting without calculation, cultivating the Tao so much that mystically you know the right thing to do without having to think about that, rationally speaking. And so again, this might be a little bit of a jab to the Confucianists and their idea of cultivation through scholarship and book learning, etc. And even their advice, the Taoist advice to the emperor, is simply be the sun and allow your ministers, the planets, to gravitate around you, and be the source of the Tao, of Yang and Yin through your ministers to the people. And then there's also a notion in the Tao Te Ching, politically speaking, of servant leadership, that the true leader, Lao Tzu says, is a follower, that he serves his people. Almost sounds like a Christian theme there, something out of the Sermon on the Mount, or out of Jesus of Nazareth, his idea that the Son of Man comes to serve and not be served. And there's a little bit of a sort of an overlap there, but the idea is that if you want to lead people, you need to do that by example. You need to set a proper example and cultivate the Tao, master the Tao, and then the people will simply gravitate toward you without calculation, without effort, in a sense. Here's a Taoist quotation from Zhuangzi. He was a later Taoist sage. He wrote commentaries on the Tao Te Ching, on Master Lao's great work. You can see he's a little bit later, 4th century BCE. And he's a very kind of nonsensical guy. Interesting. In fact, Professor Matter is going to have you read some Zen Buddhist stories. This was a form of Buddhism in China that was heavily influenced by Chinese Taoism. It was later brought to Japan and became Zen. It was called Chan Buddhism in China. One of the first stories was by this sage, Zhuangzi, and he talks about meditating, and then all of a sudden a butterfly flutters past, and he wonders, after his meditation, whether he's a man dreaming of a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming of a man. And in that sense, the Taoist point is that when all things are immersed in Tao, there is no separation. So it wouldn't matter if he were the butterfly or if he were the human focusing on the butterfly. Ultimately, there's no separation in the Tao. You can see that this artist has him in a deeply meditative state, and has pictured a toad has hopped up here, and I kind of like that again because it shows the theme of the emphasis that humans are simply a part of the overall flow of life through nature, through the Tao in Taoism. Zhuangzi says, why scurry about looking for the truth? Can you be still and see it in the mountain, the pine tree, yourself? Don't imagine that you'll discover it by accumulating more knowledge. Knowledge creates doubt, and doubt makes you ravenous for more knowledge. You can't get full eating this way. The wise person dines on something more subtle. He eats the understanding that the named was born from the unnamed, and here he's directly referencing the Tao, that all being flows from non-being, the describable world emanates from an indescribable source. And here's the key statement. He finds this subtle truth inside his own self and becomes completely content and is not agitated. Therefore, where do you find the truth in this tradition? In Taoism, you find the truth inside your own self, and you become completely content. And so I think that emphasizes the themes that we're talking about. Now here I have a link in the next slide, another quotation from Lao Tzu from the Tao Te Ching, the soft and the pliable will defeat the hard and the strong. Again, a lot of paradox there, the contradictory seemingly, right? Soft and pliable defeating the hard and the strong. And if you follow the link here, you'll go to a YouTube video. It's about a 15-minute introduction to the work itself, the Tao Te Ching. And that'll wrap up our summary of Lao Tzu, Master Lao, and Taoism, and the Tao Te Ching, the great work of Master Lao. Next, I'm going to deal with Confucius and Confucianism, and then sort of sum up with some distinctions between Taoism and Confucianism for you. But let me go ahead and stop this video so that it doesn't become too long. Okay, thank you.